Welcome to the second CoRE conversation. My name is John Lim, and I'm Executive Director and Professor at the Center of Regulatory Excellence, or CoRE, at the Duke National University of Singapore Medical School, or Duke-NUS, in Singapore. Our inaugural conversation in 2021 was with Ms. Emma Cook, Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency, and that was a highly enlightening and rich discussion. And so I'm delighted that we can continue the series today with another distinguished guest and an old friend, Dr. Peter Honig. Peter sits on CoRE's advisory board, but you'll hear a lot more about his varied experiences in a few minutes. Joining us today online are participants and alumni of our professional education programs and a wider audience representing CoRE's partners and stakeholders, as well as friends and colleagues of Peter's. This conversation series aims to allow experienced regulatory professionals like Peter to share their insights and career journeys to help younger colleagues move forward as next generation leaders. There will be an opportunity toward the end of this session for you to pose questions to Peter using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We've already taken on board questions submitted by several of you when you registered earlier for this webinar. Now, it's been my privilege to have known Peter from when I was CEO of Singapore's Health Sciences Authority, and that's quite a number of years ago. And I first met him at meetings of the Center for Innovation in Regulatory Science, or CIRS, as well as at other conferences in the years intervening. However, I must say it was not until we started preparing for this conversation that I discovered how rich and deep are Peter's experiences. He's board certified in internal medicine and clinical pharmacology, has a degree in public health. He was the founder and first director of the Office of Drug Safety at the US FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, or CDER. And he subsequently moved to industry to hold strategic and global leadership positions in drug and vaccine development and regulatory affairs at Merck, AstraZeneca, and most recently at Pfizer. Peter is also a past president of the American Society of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. But rather than my rattling on, I think we should hear from Peter himself. So welcome, Peter, to the 2022 CoRE conversation. And perhaps we should, before we get to the more professional aspects of your career, we should start right at the beginning. And I wonder if you would like to walk all of us through the more formative and personal aspects of your life and background. Could you take us back in time and tell us more about your interests when you were growing up? Peter?
Yes. Yeah. Well, thank you, John. And first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity. You know, following in Emer's footsteps is really quite intimidating to me. So I'm quite honored to be your second guest in this series. Yeah. So, you know, back in the dark ages when I was growing up in New York, to parents, a father who had immigrated from Europe and a mother from a very small town in the upper Midwest of the United States. And, you know, my father was quite international. He grew up in Indonesia, and he was educated and trained as a physician in the Netherlands. And my earliest memories really date back to interacting with him, including going on house calls when physicians actually made house calls with him in Queens, New York. And I really noted his ability to interact with all sorts of people and deal with some challenging medical, but also challenging social issues. And needless to say, I saw medicine through him as the ultimate confluence of science and humanity. And much of the time, even in the early 1960s, he did much of his work pro bono, or he was compensated for his work, his services in kind, with services, food, baked goods, other stuff that he would bring home. I remember one of his patients was a TV repairman, and you know that as compensation, he would come and fix our television sets, and that person became my informal uncle. You know, I knew him for the rest of my life, and he was a great friend of mine as well. But anyway, that's sort of the formative things when I thought the practice of medicine was a noble calling, and you know, I was set on my path from there.
That's fascinating. And how much of your growing up in New York and those experiences have sort of shaped you along the way and contributed to your values? I mean, you've talked about the impact on you taking up medicine and the footsteps of your father, but what about the whole sort of growing up context? How has that affected or influenced you?
Well, as I said before, role models have always been very important in my life, and having a very strong role model in my father and my mother as both strong people that valued empathy and valued education, I think was a very strong influence. So, being a firstborn son, John, you probably are aware that the need to sort of achieve and please your parents was a was a major motivating factor for me. That's not the only motivations, of course, but you do want to make them proud.
Mm. And so you were saying that really influenced your desire for education, because I noticed you've got a lot of degrees, but my colleagues highlighted the really interesting one that in fact your first degree was a BA in history from Columbia. How did that come about, and then how did you make the leap from there to internal medicine, clinical pharmacology, public health, and regulatory affairs?
Well, that's an easy one. Going to Columbia, I was going to be a pre-med, and the pre-med course burden is pretty heavy in science. And I thought it would be really good to take advantage of a world-class history department at Columbia to have a broader experience, educational experience, and to really have a more well-rounded education. It might be the last chance to really to do that, and I never regretted it. With regards to career pathing, it really started after being accepted to med school, and then the conundrum of trying to figure out how to pay for it. In the United States, universities and postgraduate education is not free. It's not part of the government benefits. So trying to figure out a way to pay for med school, even at that time, was quite expensive. And my parents made it clear to me that I was on my own, so I had to look for options to pay for this. And loans are, of course, an option. I wasn't particularly keen on coming out of med school with loans, so I looked at government-sponsored programs, and the National Health Service Corps, back in the when I was going to med school, had been established, which was really intended to improve primary care medical service in underserved communities in the United States. And the notion was that in return for funding your medical school education, you would agree to serve 4 years in an indigent community, the working poor. And that was very much aligned with my values, and as I described. And ultimately, unfortunately, the US government administration changed, and many of the underserved communities that would have been eligible for my service were de-designated as eligible. And my only option was to work in the US prison system, providing essential medical services as the chief physician to incarcerated prisoners. And I wound up at the infamous Rikers Island jail in New York City. As you can imagine, that was a tough 4 years, but I learned a lot about people and issues with not only the U.S. correctional system, but also the disparities in healthcare availability, in populations, even in a rich country like the United States. And I also learned very much about interacting with difficult situations. But the one founding principle I had is, if you treat people with respect, they will in kind be respectful to you. The prisons are violent places, but fortunately I never had the problem with that, because I was perceived as being fair. And that goes a long way. But working in Rikers Island, this is an amusing anecdote. It has the byproduct of not being able to go anywhere in New York without being recognized. And I don't know what that says about New York, but it was true that I ran into many of my patients on the streets and buses and subways of New York, with many stories to tell of those encounters, maybe some other time. But after that, after coming out of my service at Rikers, I followed a woman to Washington, who later became my wife, to work as an internal medicine doctor at Georgetown University Medical Center for a brief period of time. After which I decided to do my fellowship in clinical pharmacology that you described, which interestingly enough was co-sponsored by the FDA. And my advisor and mentor in that program was Dr. Carl Peck, who would later become the director at CDER. He was the immediate precedent director to Janet Woodcock at CDER. And during that fellowship, I conducted translational and clinical research into metabolism-based drug interactions and drug-induced cardiac repolarization abnormalities, had many publications around that. And this is, again, where my previously mentioned sense of filial piety comes into play. You know, I'd always intended to potentially go to industry after my fellowship, but Dr. Peck put his arm around me and advised me he said it would be much better if I went and joined FDA with him, or at least for a few years, to really learn drug development, drug regulation, and leadership. And a few years turned into 13 years, and it was probably the best career decision I ever made.
Well, that's really extraordinary. I mean, I've never heard the story about the prison service before, but I think now that you talk about it,
I would tell you stories that will make you laugh and recoil in horror.
Okay, we'll have to arrange another conversation with you on that then, just specifically on that aspect. But I think certainly, as I was saying earlier, as we're preparing for this, I was finding more things about you. And even in the course of the conversation, I'm learning more and more about you, which I think paints a very nice, well-rounded picture of who you are. And actually, to my mind, at least, begins to make it clearer, really sort of explaining who you are and why you are the person you are. And that's a compliment, by the way. So let's move on to your career, which you've already begun to talk about. You said you went to the FDA, you worked with Carl Peck, and then you spent 13 years at the FDA. So what happened then in terms of making that decision? You said you wanted to go to industry earlier, but you were with the FDA 13 years. So what finally was the point when you concluded it was time to join industry?
You know, it's really quite interesting. I got to know myself very well over the years. And one thing I do find is that when I tend to get bored and antsy when the learning curve flattens a bit. So after being at the FDA for 13 years and, you know, both in the Office of New Drugs and then later in the Office of Drug Safety, I felt that my learning curve had plateaued a bit. And I always thought, you know, it's fairly easy. It's relatively easy, John, you know, as a regulator. I don't want to say it's easy to be a regulator, but to sit in judgment of other people's work. And I thought maybe, you know, what's it like to be on the other side, you know, where you don't necessarily know the answer, and to really think about drug development. So that was really the motivation, you know, and I was probably in my mid 40s at that point, and I thought, this is probably the time. If I don't try something new now, even though it was scary to leave, I was having a lot of fun at FDA, and all. Believe me, I was still had a lot of friends there and a lot of colleagues that I respected greatly. But I thought, you know, this is about the best time. And Dr. Peck, you know, I called him again and I said, you know, I'm thinking about going to industry. And he said, well, if you go to industry, go to a good company. Go to a company that you respect, does good science, and you know who they are. You've worked with them, you know, at the agency and seen some of their work. So, you know, that's how it came.
And what was it like when you made that initial transition from being a regulator at the FDA and you joined? Was it Merck? Was that the first company that you went to?
Yeah, Merck was the first company.
Yeah.
And
what was the experience like?
It was, well, I knew a lot of people at Merck, you know, both through the American Society of Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. I knew Dr. Alan Neese, I knew Dr. Barry Gertz, I knew many of these other people. So it wasn't completely an unknown entity to me. You know, I had a lot of respect for the science and scientists coming out of that company, and many other companies, I should say. But I have to say, the funniest thing was that, you know, when I was at the FDA, people, you know, listened to whatever, they hung on every word I would say, you know, to an industry. When I got there, my advice was, more easily discounted, I should say.
Within the company, you mean?
Yeah, sure. But
So
it
that
was
was
a
about
good thing.
yeah.
The good thing the good thing about my training, in medicine and clinical pharmacology, I knew the language and I knew the science, and in a deeply science-based company, that's a lot of that's currency. So that goes a long way.
Mm. So give us an overview of the three big companies you work with: Merck, AstraZeneca, and Pfizer. What did you do in each of these? And share with us a bit about the transitions from one to the other, because I think you also went into sort of different areas in each of them as well, right?
A little bit. And I think that really goes to one of the issues around career pathing. And I always had the view that in order to be successful in life, you need to really demonstrate not only consistent excellence in whatever you do and enthusiasm for your task, and as I said before, empathy for people. I think you need to have a healthy curiosity and courage to try new things. So at Merck, it was very natural for me to go, and my initial job was pharmacovigilance and compliance, and then I added regulatory affairs, and then some other things, including clinical operations and running, overseeing the Merck manual. All of these things taught me things. Do you go to school to learn how to do any of this stuff? No, but you just need to bring your principles and your science to bear on this, and then learn how to trust people. Learn who you can trust and how and whether you can trust them. And that's one of the learnings I had that goes way back. If you want to hear about that, I can tell you a little bit about one of my formative experiences as a medical resident.
Please do.
So, when you come out of medical school, you're a doctor, but I wouldn't say you should be trusted with patients at that point. So that's why you do postgraduate training, as you know. You really don't know as much, or as hope you know as much, about taking care of patients. So you do your internship and your residency where you learn these things. And the first day of internship is a terrifying experience, because the first thing you want to do is no harm. So, the first night of call, where you have to stay in the hospital overnight or several overnights for admissions to the hospital, can be a pretty intimidating experience. And the place where I trained had this unique system where there were 3 different senior residents, medical residents, admitting to my service. And I remember lucky me, luck of the draw, my first day of internship was also my first call night. So it was like right into it. And I remember that night and that experience like it was yesterday. And so the progression starts, and the first resident called me and said he had a patient that was coming up from the emergency room. No other information, no advice, no clue what to expect. I was absolutely terrified. What is going to appear? How is this patient going to benefit from me or not? So that was the first experience. And the second resident called later in the evening and told me that a patient was being admitted. And he told me the probable diagnosis. He told me exactly what tests to order, blood tests, radiology, told me what to do, and then told me to call him with the results of the tests when they were available. And then he told me exactly what to do then. Actually had me write the orders for the patient, while he was standing there looking at me. And I said, well, this is not exactly a learning experience, but I have to say, from the patient's perspective, it was probably a good thing. But there was really no learning opportunities at all. And then the third resident called and said, Peter, and he was the only one that actually called me by my name. And he said, Peter, we have a very interesting and delightful patient who needs your help and will be arriving on your floor shortly. So when the patient gets there, why don't you talk to her, do an examination, and then we can decide. He used the word we should decide what we should do next. I was completely motivated. He treated me like a colleague, and I felt safe. I felt psychologically safe that there was a backstop here. And I did, what he suggested. And then he listened to my differential diagnosis and my treatment plan, and he said, good. And call me anytime if you need help. And he became, it's no doubt, he became my favorite resident and role model. And years later, after this experience, I was still in contact with him. And I asked him about that night, and he pretended to remember. He probably didn't. But he said, yeah, I remember. I was evaluating how you thought and whether I could trust you with patients. And I said, wow. And I said, that became my style. I don't know what I call, you can call, I don't have a title for it, but it's more like participatory leadership. And providing psychological safety for the people you work with so they can feel comfortable in trying and potentially even failing. And I can only hope that I influenced people that I worked with as positively as he did for me. Still my friend to this day.
It's extraordinary, though, that, I mean, you said you went in that first day or night with much fear and trepidation, and you learned such significant lessons that have affected you basically for the rest of your career, it seems. That's a very fortunate sort of outcome of your first night of being on call. I can't remember anything about my first night of being on call.
You tend to remember things very vividly, only a few things in your lives that are sort of seminal moments. Right. And that was a seminal moment for me with regards to learning how to be a leader.
And so there's one question my colleagues put out. I mean, from this, what you've described, and as you've gone through your career, what are the sort of three biggest lessons from your career which you would be able to cite today? I don't know whether it's a fair question.
Yeah.
Do three big things stand out for you as you look back over the course of your working life?
Actually, right. I do have. It's really quite interesting that you asked. You asked for three things. So I've always had the view that in order to be successful in life and a career, you need to demonstrate three things. One of them is consistent excellence, enthusiasm, and empathy. And I've always guided the people that I've worked with in any organization I've led that they should aspire to have three critical attributes. One of them is, if you're in the regulatory affairs organization, have a commanding knowledge and expertise in that role. So, you're representing regulatory affairs, that your regulatory acumen should be outstanding. The second is you're going to be a member of a team. And in order to be a full member of that team, you need to have a working knowledge of the science of drug development and the vocabulary that the other members of the team are using, because otherwise you won't understand what's being discussed. So you need to have a knowledge of the science. You need to, including manufacturing and commercialization, as they all sit on those multidisciplinary teams. And if you don't understand the language and the inputs of those colleagues around the table, from pharm sci, toxicology, clinical pharmacology, stats, you can't be full participants in the debate and decision making. And finally, I emphasize the importance of leadership at all levels. Now, and they've all seen it. But teams sometimes circle the drain. I call it circling the drain, because they don't really have leadership. And how many times have we seen teams unable to progress due to lack of that leadership, and for many reasons? And frequently the opportunity to lead, even without the formal title of leader, presents itself almost every day. So I emphasize the importance of individual development plans that offered though training in those three elements: domain expertise, overall knowledge of drug development, and then we put in leadership training as well in many of the organizations I led.
Mm. It's very inspiring listening to you, Peter. I mean, although you're looking back on the approaches you've taken, the lessons you've learned, I mean, I'm learning a lot just listening to you at this point.
I feel
There's
like
a question that is,
John, I feel like it's an obituary.
I think it should be anything but. We already committed to a second conversation, right, about your time in the prison service. So we'll hold that for another day. But there's another question, and I think we had talked earlier about addressing this. One of the participants and registration put this question: kindly share with us your experiences and challenges, and probably also dwell a bit on the joy you find in managing regulatory affairs and product safety in many parts of the world. Talk a bit about joy.
Well, I think joy is an important part. If you're not having fun, fun can be described in many ways. I'm not talking about laugh out loud fun. I'm just talking about the joy of, serving a mission. First of all, you need to be in an organization that makes you proud. And, in what better field or career can you work in than medical product development? I mean, this is a noble cause. You're not making nylon stockings here. You're making, potential medical products that are going to save people's lives and make people's lives better. So, look for that type of mission in your life. And then, I think Reg Affairs, this is primarily a Reg Affairs audience, is an extremely exciting place to work. And whenever I would recruit people into the medical regulatory affairs function from other parts of a company, I would emphasize that, this is in the service, not only service of a noble mission of improving public health on behalf of patients. We're working in a role in regulatory affairs that blends science, law, commercial, social inputs, and can be also an incredible center for innovation as science progresses. You see some of the advanced medical products that are coming out, and regulators, to a certain extent, are learning how to regulate these, and the ability to influence that in a regulatory affairs function at a company that's developing some of these novel breakthrough products is pretty darn exciting, I would say. So joy is good for the soul, and it also makes you someone that people like to work with, right? So if you're enthusiastic and joyful about the job, and we all know who those people are. We also know those people who are not joyful, and those people are energy drains. So I would say, you need to bring that enthusiasm every day in the service of an incredible mission.
Well, I think the audience is not going to disagree with you, because you're sort of preaching to the converted, as it were, here in terms of regulatory affairs being a critical area. But is it not also the case that in the course of your career, when you're dealing with regulatory affairs and other parts of companies, when, let's say, the business marketing areas come to the fore and you've got to make a case, there are also challenges and issues that you have to address. Can you tell us a bit more about these kind of issues, and how does that balance out with the joy you just described?
Well, yeah, I mean, sometimes within a company, there are orthogonal interests at play, and that's the role you have in a company. If you're a commercial person or a regulatory person, you have different accountabilities and different objectives. The real challenge is blending those into a common strategy. And I think one of the most fun things in working in a regulatory affairs function is blending all those things. I talk about the confluence of scientific, regulatory, commercial, all those things that sort of go into a product development plan, and the ability to harmonize that across, if you're in a multinational, harmonize that across all the different regions, and not only incorporating the regulatory inputs but the payer inputs as well, the reimbursement characteristics, really informing the design of the program. I don't think there's anything more exciting than that. It's challenging and it's hard, And sometimes, you really have to make some compromises occasionally. When I was just going back and looking at it from the other side, I frequently, go back to my days at FDA when I would look at a program and I go, why did they do that? We gave them this advice and they didn't quite follow it exactly. So why did they design the program this way? And sometimes I would ask them that, why did you do this? And they would say, well, we were getting inputs from Europe and we're getting inputs from Japan and inputs from Singapore. And, we wanted to create a product development strategy and a product development plan that would meet everyone's goals. And sometimes you have to make compromises. And I thought, well, that's very interesting, but that's also very creative.
Yeah. I was at a panel discussion last week, and this is sort of young on small companies developing more med tech devices. And it was interesting, one person on the panel, when he was asked about engaging with regulators, national regulators, basically said that large companies do not view regulatory authorities as an obstacle, because I think small startups tend to have that kind of concern. But he was saying that large companies see regulation, no matter how diverse it is, and of course we always talk about more harmonization and things, as just something that you would deal with. I mean, is this the kind of view that you've seen in the multinational companies you've worked with as well? I mean, we've heard a lot of complaints when I sit on the side of the regulator, hearing industry talking about different regulations, especially in our part of the world here. But I was quite struck by that very positive view.
I don't know if I would agree with that completely. And it's hard to distill. It's hard to distill, opinions down to a single opinion. Everybody's got. First of all, the one thing you have to know: if you work in a large company, everybody is a regulatory affairs expert, even if they're not in regulatory. So you frequently get that. The other thing you get a lot in large multinationals is regulatory opinion shopping in the function. So, the team member, and that's another lesson I learned. So the team member, on the product development team would give the regulatory perspective that would inform the plan. And, other members of the team didn't like it. So they would call other people in the function, including me, saying, what do you think about this? And, they wouldn't exactly tell me the context, but they would, I'm pretty good at smelling these things out. So I would say I made sure that we always put in meetings where the regulatory affairs function would be completely aligned on what we were saying at the team level. So that if this opinion shopping did manifest, they would get the same input from me as they would get from the director or assistant director on the product team. And those meetings were also extremely educationally valuable, because everybody was invited, not only the team member and senior management, but also anybody else in the function that wanted to go and listen to how a more seasoned, experienced regulatory person would think about a challenge. But you mentioned this perspective of large companies and small companies. There is also the perspective that from large companies that smaller companies get away with more, because regulators, make concessions to smaller companies that they wouldn't make the larger company. I could tell you that's unabashedly false. The standard is the standard, but there's the perception in big pharma that the smaller companies get away with it because they're not able to do that, and the FDA or HSA asks a bigger company like Merck or Pfizer to do more. It's not true, but that's a perception.
Yeah. Well, I think having been in the FDA, and I can tell you from the HSA side, that's really not true as well. So I agree with you there. Yeah. Let's come to, there are two questions in the Q&A box, and let's take the first one first. Juliana says, thanks you very much for your very insightful sharing, really has motivated her. But do you have advice for a pharmacist with zero actual work experience in regulatory to be able to secure a role in regulatory affairs? Because it seems that every employer is looking for only someone with experience. What advice would you have for Juliana?
Yeah, this is a challenge. I would say networking is really important. It may not be as much what you know as who you might know and might be able to leverage. So again, if you have somebody that's in the company that can vouch for your intelligence, your scientific background, obviously you have that as a pharmacist. I would say that's really important. So I would say networking is something that is a lifelong value, not only for potential job opportunities, but also for learning. To be able to interact with people and understand, how they got to where they got and learn from that. So yeah, I frequently hear that. I don't have any experience, but regulatory is what I call an open door. We're willing to take people from almost any field. If you look at regulatory as a destination, very few people started there. They all started in something else, whether it was in clinical, or many of them come from basic science. And they were observed by the regulatory affairs person to have potential. This person is smart and trainable, and they expressed an interest. And we created, in several of my companies, we created these shadowing opportunities for people outside in other disciplines to come and learn about regulatory affairs and what it does. Because a lot of people don't have a clue. They think it's all strategy, but they don't understand, some of the more tactical aspects of, a regulatory affairs function. So it's a real eye-opener sometimes to see. And there's a lot, regulatory affairs functions have a very diverse set of opportunities. You can get into regulatory operations, which is, I think, more akin to a manufacturing function than almost anything else. Assembling and writing, assembling, quality assuring a dossier is a necessary function, but it's a very distinct function from the strategic function. I like both, actually. I think they're both interesting and challenging, and making a operational function as efficient as possible and innovating within a compliance-driven organization, I think, is also a very exciting challenge. But there's so many functions in regulatory affairs that are interesting and opportunities. So I think you should look at it as a broader opportunity. When I think about it, ad promo reviews, reviewing promotional materials is also, requires some clinical acumen. So as a clinical pharmacist, you probably have some skills there as well. So don't view it as, a monolithic opportunity. View it as, understand what the regulatory affairs function is, and, and target people that work there and might be able to help you get a foot in the door.
Of course, I would add you should take some courses from CoRE as well, our graduate certificate program. I think the modules will also be of benefit to you as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. And the courses at CoRE also provide enormous networking opportunities.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, actually, that is true. The networking is one of the critical aspects in addition to the content. So, Juliana, I hope we wish you well in your career, and I hope that Peter's advice will be of use to you. There's another question from Surya, and Surya thanks you for sharing your time and wealth of knowledge with all of us. And the question is this: have you always had a clear vision of the direction you were heading towards in your career? What advice would you share with aspiring professionals who are exploring their interests in new or novel areas in health products regulation?
I would hope that what you've heard realize makes you all appreciate the fact that careers are rarely linear. I went from wanting to be a country doc to working in going to a majoring in history, to working in a prison, to working at FDA, to industry. If you had asked me when I went to medical school, would I be working at, a multinational like Merck, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, I would have said, I don't even know what those are. I never heard of them. So it's not linear, but so the question is, how do you get there? And I think my advice would be curious and be courageous. Don't, have confidence, the 3 C's: confidence, courage, and curiosity. Doors open all the time. Most people don't go through them because, for whatever reason, they're comfortable in their current situation. But sometimes opportunities are not recognized for what they are. I think the ability to sort of stand back and say, and this is an opportunity, and I have enough confidence to, if it isn't the right one, there's no one-way street in life. You can always pivot and go somewhere else, do something else. So that was my mantra. When I got to FDA, I was relentlessly curious, and I would, as a trained clinical pharmacologist, I got in, even though I was in the Office of New Drugs, I got very heavily involved in writing ClinPharm guidances. Because, as a physician, clinical pharmacologist, I was providing insights that would, make some of these valuable. And then I expressed an interest in doing regulatory research. And, Bob Temple, who, is to this day is one of the most, influential people in my life, and somebody I respect as, the very model of a modern major regulator, to quote Gilbert and Sullivan, really influenced me tremendously. And I said, well, I want to do some regulatory research. He said, great, that's what nights and weekends are for. I said, okay. So I did some regulatory research, and I wrote up a paper and I gave it to him, and he was magnanimous enough to read it. I got it back, and it weighed more because of the edits he had made. He was famous for taking these felt pens and writing edits. And I looked at it and I go, first of all, it weighed more from the ink. And then I looked at it and it looked like it had been savaged. And I was completely disheartened. And he looked at me and he goes, Peter, it's really good. It can be better. It can be better. And I go, wow. That's when I realized feedback is a gift, and feedback from somebody like that who took the time out of his incredibly busy schedule to look at a paper, some entry-level medical officer had written. I go, wow, this is pretty cool. And that set me on my, my career that, again, always have time for people and always be curious.
Well, I hope that those in the audience with these questions will encounter bosses like you and mentors like you as they move on through their careers, even as they take those opportunities.
Well,
Thank you very much for answering those questions.
I hope that John, I hope that one thing you take from this is the importance of finding a mentor. Finding a mentor that really cares about you and your career and really about your well-being and has time to dedicate to you. They're out there. You have to actively seek them out. They're not going to find you.
Do you have any advice on how to seek them out? It's sometimes not that easy, I think, within a company, organizational setting to just find a mentor.
You'd be surprised how accommodating people are. Look, just observe. Who do you, who in your, when you're in an organization, who do you think is a good leader? Who does it right? So your advice is really to actually go forward and approach them. Is that right? Absolutely. You'd be amazed at how delighted they would be to actually share that with you, even though you perceive them as being extremely busy. Yeah, I think that's true. It's true. But it's got to be a two-way street, John. Yeah. You have to bring something to the table as well. So Yep. Let's move, Peter, to the question of COVID-19. We can't sort of move on without at least touching on this. So as we are coming out of a pandemic, which we are at this point, even though there's still cases spiking here and there,
what has the regulatory experience or perspective been, do you think, throughout the last 3 years or so? And what sort of key themes have you observed? What lessons have been learned, maybe not just from a regulatory perspective, but from multinationals and even nations for that matter? Share your thoughts with us, Peter.
I think it's a really important question. And, I was fortunate, in my time at Pfizer, I spent, almost every day and night for the last year at Pfizer working on the COVID vaccine, the mRNA vaccine at Pfizer BioNTech. So, there are a lot of learnings from that. And British Prime Minister Churchill once said, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." Right. So the pandemic has really been devastating to global health, global economy, supply chains, and, I think we'd all admit personal well-being as well. As an anecdote, I can't tell you, how happy I was, how giddy I was to fly to Singapore and make a long walk to a taxi line. I never thought I would be so excited about something. But thank you for your hosting your wonderful CoRE conference last month, and the ability to travel again to a delightful country and be stimulated by your conference. But this pandemic exacerbated health inequities within countries, between countries. But I think importantly, it has really the potential to be a transformative event in many aspects of not only drug development and regulation, but daily life. The Zoom generation, right? And how we interact with each other. But, reflecting on the situation, we can imagine a role of health authorities, industry, academia, and convening bodies such as ICH and other groups really working together to immortalize some of the incredible but necessary innovations that were put in play during the pandemic. For example, ICH is now actively updating the existing guidelines, like the modernization of the GCP guidelines, E6, and the new pharmacoepi topics are good examples of really modernizing the thinking, informed at least in part by what we did during the pandemic. But you can also envision taking on new work to harmonize and immortalize some of the innovations we developed during the pandemic, so they can be applied to other therapeutic areas, like digital capture of endpoints and things like that. And we're all cognizant of the current and ongoing capacity limitations of health authorities, even now, and to make sure, but we really are thoughtful in what we do here. Some industry colleagues and myself wrote an opinion piece on this very issue. It was in Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics way back in August 2020, because I think many of us realized we're in a brave new world now, which is informed by necessity being the mother of invention. The title of this paper was COVID-19, a Catalyst to Accelerate Regulatory Transformation. And it really describes some of the significant early innovation catalyzed by the pandemic, such as digitally enabled decentralized trials, remote endpoint data capture, remote monitoring auditing that could inform for future practice and potential regulatory oversight as well. And we also saw a rapid emergence of real-world data and real-world evidence to inform regulatory decision-making and public policy. And a good example of that was the use of RWE in some countries to answer really important questions about the vaccine, such as durability of the effectiveness, the need and timing of booster strategies, the emergence of variants, the clinical effectiveness of vaccines against those variants, and the quantification of post-authorization emergent AEs, such as myocarditis or that thrombocytopenic thrombosis that we're seeing. The other thing I wrote about in that paper was regulatory adaptability and flexibility in data requirements and regulatory responsiveness in the face of COVID public health crises. And it applied to innovation in clinical evidence generation, but also risk-based preclinical and fit-for-purpose CMC requirements that theoretically, and I think justifiably, could be examined for the application to other serious and significant life-threatening diseases, so the potential therapies could be advanced more rapidly. This needs to be balanced, of course, against resources and capacity, but I think at the very least we should try to inventory what we did and what worked, and may potentially immortalized, the real innovations that have the potential to be useful to both sides. And then finally, I just want to say, at about the same time, members of my team at Pfizer published a paper in BMG Global Health that highlighted the pandemic really exposing significant weaknesses in some regulatory systems, such as fundamental lack of digital capabilities, but also cataloged the fact that most regulatory national authorities demonstrated incredible adaptability and creativity and resilience in the face of this crisis. But these durable innovations, I think, have the potential, and I would be disappointed if we just relapsed back into the pre-COVID way of doing things and thinking about drug regulation and drug development.
But do you think there's a bit of a risk there because of the pandemic fatigue that not just, within the regulatory space or within companies or regulators, but at societal levels? And in fact, everything you've said, I think those are the kind of positives that have come out from a very, very difficult and tragic situation. But I think I've heard from various quarters and even read about it that people are a little concerned that due to fatigue, the good intentions related to all the initiatives you've mentioned may actually fizzle out simply because people will either revert back to the normal, although I don't think anything can completely go back to the normal, or simply because they then have other priorities. So I don't know what your views are on this. I think there is a real risk, but I'd be keen to hear your thoughts. Yeah,
John, I agree with you completely, and I think we do need to consider the COVID pandemic to be a bit of a unique situation. The confluence of interest in finding a solution to COVID was so important in catalyzing progress. I mentioned the regulatory and industry innovation here, but the overwhelming confluence of interest of patients and investigators to participate in clinical trials, including diverse populations, was absolutely necessary. How can you even think of enrolling a 50,000 patient outcome trial in 4 weeks? This is probably not something that's going to be recapitulated in the future. But I do, and there's some challenges we faced as well. In the United States, I don't know how it was in Singapore, but we had this flip side that our healthcare system, including regulators and ethics committees, IRBs, were flooded with competing trials, many of which were assessing likely ineffective treatments because they were either there was no scientific justification for the drug, or they were being studied in a scientifically deficient manner, underpowered, uncontrolled, poorly designed trials. So I think this last point really underscores the importance of being prepared for the next potential pandemic, with the establishment of master protocols, some efficient prioritization on the part of health authorities of clinical studies, re-examining the IRB ethics committee processes for this kind of work. And I really commend, when I was in Singapore last month, I learned about, your with NUS, the program for research and epidemic preparedness and response that you're working on. And I think this is an incredible initiative, and I really commend the Singapore government and the university for really putting in place, an active surveillance program in Southeast Asia for emerging pathogens, but also the ability to potentially collaborate across borders to deal with these emerging threats. So I acknowledge burnout, but I also acknowledge, I think we can't expect that. What we saw during the pandemic, I couldn't believe it. We were getting responses from regulatory authorities in a matter of hours, on protocol amendments. That's not something you're going to see sustainable in the future. But I do think some of the innovations we've seen in clinical trial content, evidence generation, acceptance of alternative sources of evidence, I think those are the kind of learnings that we can sustain and scale.
So, well, we're down to our last 5 minutes already. As we had said earlier, the hour would just go by. But given all these things, from your perspective, how different, and this is a question that came from one of the participants at registration, how different do you see the future of regulatory affairs? And what are the capabilities that will ready us for the future?
Well, I said I think it all starts with having a good regulatory affairs function. Being in a company that really values the strategic importance of regulatory affairs, the ability of a regulatory affairs function to establish trust, an industrial, company-based regulatory affairs function to establish trust with regulatory authorities, such that when you do, you're not only asking for something, you're actually providing some insights. So, because regulatory agencies are learning entities as well. It's not like they have all this prepackaged wisdom and experience. They learn how to regulate some of these new advanced modalities, CAR-Ts, antisense, oligos, gene therapy. You think about this, a lot of this is sort of regulation that's evolving before our very eyes, so I think the ability to communicate, in a common language of science, based in regulatory principles, in a regulatory affairs function is something that's always going to be valuable and potentially, transformative in being able to not only get the product, through the regulatory affairs, agency, but also help them understand and learn how to regulate some of these brilliant, exciting new science that's coming forward. I just can't believe it. I see these companies. I work at Blackstone now as private equity as well, and we look at investing in some of these things, and the science out there is just breathtaking. And there are no regulatory precedents for many of them, as to how they're going to be regulated. What are the CMC expectations going to be for some of these programs? And I think it's an exciting place to be because you have the ability to influence the future.
So any final comment, although your last comment probably is a very good point to end on, an exciting place to influence the future, but in the last minute or so,
no, I just want to
closing
thank you.
Comments from you, Peter?
Yeah, no, I just want to thank you for the time. I think this has been a lot of fun. It has gone very, very quickly, and it's always good to be involved. I can't wait to come back to Singapore for the next trip.
Yeah, we look forward to having you here with us. It was great talking to you in person. In fact, I was thinking we should have done this live, but I think the schedule was just too tight. So we're going back to our sort of Zoom meetings. But I think it's been wonderful talking to you, Peter. Thank you for sharing all your insights. I've been inspired, as I said, and I hope the audience has been equally inspired. I believe they have by everything you've shared, your life experience, your wisdom, and your whole perspective, I think, on regulatory affairs and regulation. So it leaves me to thank you, Peter, not only for who you are, but also for what you've brought to the field in your career and what you still have to offer from your perspective now. So thank you very much, Dr. Peter Honig, and I look forward to further conversations. We did say there are other things we can talk about on other occasions based on the interesting nuggets that you shared with us at the beginning of this session. But with that, I would like to thank the audience for spending the last hour with us. I trust that you have gleaned a great deal from what Peter's had to share, and we look forward to future sessions at CoRE Conversations that will help you in your career development. So with that, it leaves me to thank Peter and to thank all of you, and wish you a good day, a good evening, and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Cheers.